You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
On this episode of From Embers, we're going to share content from the 2020 Montreal Anarchist Bookfair, which was held online this year due to the pandemic. If you listen to the podcast edition of From Embers, it can be easy to forget that this show also airs on the campus and community radio station in Kingston, CFRC 101.9 FM. We at From Embers are also involved in other projects at the station, including Prison Radio, which broadcasts interviews, shoutouts, and song requests for local prisoners, as well as a newer project called Radio Pandemic. Radio Pandemic was founded just as the COVID-19 crisis hit Kingston, as many people were scrambling to figure out how to navigate the new uncertain terrain of physical distancing, government lockdowns, and online organizing. We wanted to facilitate a conversation about the rapidly changing context in our city and beyond, and established a call-in show that airs on CFRC 3 times a week. Someone from the Montreal Anarchist Bookfair was interested in our project and hosted a conversation with the Radio Pandemic Collective as part of this year's event. If you want to check out the Radio Pandemic project, the best way would be to search for Radio Pandemic on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Or tune in on Wednesday from 1 to 3 o'clock or Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. and call in. The following is an edited version of that discussion.
Yeah, I guess we want to have this panel in order to talk a bit about doing anarchist projects during the pandemic and a little bit about what that's been like. So for starters, would you want to give people a bit of an orientation around what your project has been and, maybe like a little bit of an overview of how it's gone?
We are a group of 6 people who are pretty good friends and do a fair amount of stuff together. And it wasn't long after things started rapidly closing and being canceled that we had a discussion together of what we could possibly do. And it wasn't long before we knew that there were folks in town doing mutual aid groups and things like that. And we were kind of wondering, what is something a little bit different? Like, what other needs could we fill? And a handful of us have, not me personally, but other people in the group have a lot of experience with radio in town. And that was one of the things that people would be able to continue to have access to. So somebody floated the idea of we could do a show multiple times a week. We could have people call in. We could discuss things that are going to be relevant to like the current situation and update people on how things are changing in town. And we can use it as a platform to kind of give space to people we know, whether they're in town or outside of town, that are doing pretty cool things right now. So somebody like floated that idea to the station manager, and it wasn't long before we got approval and we got 3 spots a week that we were able to fill. And it kind of took shape over the first few weeks. The topics that we have been covering have ranged really, really broadly. We have asked things like, what are you reading or what are you doing to pass the time? And we've also done things a little bit more like we've talked about prison strikes. We've talked about the issue of long-term care homes and reached out to people that have direct experience with those issues. So it's kind of had a lot of different moods, like show to show. And yeah, it's kind of continuing to evolve. I don't know if people want to throw in anything that I've kind of missed or want to talk about more about how it started.
Yeah, well, and this year we even did like our special May Day broadcast instead of the rally we'd normally be doing because, it just was a way we could reach out to people and still get those voices out there.
I guess also just like part of the reason for choosing this project was like that it was not just online. Like I think a lot of things have gone online, including the book fair, which is totally cool, and like I'm happy to be participating in it. But I personally wanted to do something that was like people who are in proximity to each other. So the thing that appealed about using like FM radio in this moment is like the reason you can hear each other is because you're actually close by each other. So we sort of framed it also at the beginning as like about connecting neighbors back to each other who might be distant from each other right now. And I think that's happened to some extent. I think there are people who tune in who are like, they would normally be seeing each other, but instead they're kind of like listening together but apart in Kingston as well.
Yeah, and one thing I would add too is that really the model for the show is based on another show called Calls from Home, which is a part of the Prison Radio Project, which some of us are also involved in, where once a month we do like a call-in show for friends and family of local prisoners, because Kingston is the prison capital of Canada. There's like 5 or 6 federal penitentiaries within the listening range of CFRC. So yeah, we basically do this show once a month where people can send shout outs and messages and song requests to people who are listening inside local prisons. And so that kind of gave us a framework within which to do this show, which is also a call-in show. And also we had the kind of like skills background to be able to easily bring that online in like 3 days from when we proposed it to when we first started doing it. I
really liked what you said about the way that it pulled people together in physical space. It kind of reminds me of back when Submedia's It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine would broadcast, or I guess more like also Trouble, with different, when screenings will happen. And even though it's an internet show, it's still, it's still something that often pulls people together into the same room to watch it when it comes out. I know I've heard that many people who are like with, if they weren't connected into, what people are calling pods these days, or were getting together with their housemates to stream some of the talks they were interested in today. And it's interesting that, the radio can kind of function in that kind of way. Because even though it is, I would have always thought of it as something like broadcasting of something that isn't really like locally focused, in the sense that it's, like physically distant. It is actually quite localizing in terms of, for what y'all are saying, like when you're broadcasting to Kingston, creating like a regional area, or even in a temporal kind of way, being, like everyone who's in the room right now listening to this chat, like at the moment. I guess a question that I would be interested with sort of starting off with would be kind of about how, for a lot of anarchists, living alongside each other is part of our politics. And so, but suddenly we're quarantined with each other and, we are like kind of the entirety of our social world. So, we're not at work, we're not, we're not physically at work, like we're not talking to coworkers. Maybe we talk to family on the occasional call, or I don't know, maybe some people talk even more than the occasional call, but probably not with the same kind of frequency. And so in some sense, I feel like the sphere of our conversation has gotten even smaller than it usually has. So I was curious about what it's been like to have a radio show which is community focused on the subject of the pandemic and be interacting with people who don't necessarily just straight up don't share our politics, and just a little bit about like what that's sort of been like.
It's been pretty interesting and nice. I am still working. I've had more time off than usual, but yeah, I'm also having some of those conversations in my day-to-day life. But on the radio, it's like been a mix of some just like total strangers or people I don't know calling in and sharing opinions. And I don't know, I find myself trying to like listen for where we might have common ground or where they're sort of expressing a lot of dissatisfaction with either like the situation the pandemic has created, or more often like the situation of just this is how the world is set up and it's bad, and that's way more evident to me right now than it usually is. So it's like I have been feeling like, oh, it's actually in a lot of ways kind of easier to talk to people about anarchist ideas right now, or like it feels like they make more sense to people, or I feel less crazy or something when I'm like doing that, which has been like pretty, I don't know, it's been good. It's been a good experience. And then also some like, it's been nice to hear from friends that I'm not seeing, or yeah, like people I'm like, I would normally be hanging out with, but I'm not hanging out with them, but we'll like catch up a bit on the radio or just like talk about how their lives are going. And that's kind of nice too.
I think that it's like, I really think it's cool how it's kind of reaching a lot of different people. And I think that for me personally, when everything started happening in March, I feel like I became a little bit nicer. Like, I feel like I'm kind of a grump a lot of the time, or at least I feel that way inside. And I'm just really critical of myself and everyone, and it's not like a good situation. But I found that when things started getting weird, I was immediately like simultaneously very appreciative of people that I know and am friends with, and the fact that like I knew people who were doing things, and not that it's bad to like kind of just cope and like Zoom your family, but I was also just really grateful to know people who wanted to do things. But at the same time, I found that I was also like more interested in people I'm acquaintances with who aren't anarchists, or who I feel like if I would reach out to them and ask them to come to a demo, they wouldn't come, and I would kind of like not expect them to come, but they're interested in like calling in to the radio show and talking about things. And it's kind of been an interesting way to like, in a really small way, like do things with people, or at least reach out to them and like have them involved with something that we're working on. Like, I have really enjoyed that it's been this weird balance of kind of being engaged with those two like very broad sort of communities.
I think, I mean, obviously the pandemic is affecting people in really different ways according to like where they're located, and in various ways, like physically and also socially and stuff. But I also think there's this kind of like strange saming quality to it, like because like literally everyone in the world is being affected in some way by this moment. Like I find personally, like I have like a rocky relationship with my parents, but suddenly we have like more things to speak about, even though usually it's like a 5-minute conversation and we have nothing in common and I have nothing to say to them. But like right now it's like, actually, there are a lot of pieces of common ground. And I also think because I had no idea what to do about the situation, like I didn't feel like there was like a stock anarchist response to a global pandemic in the way that I have felt kind of about like previous crisis moments in my life, that like it kind of feels like in some ways more natural to talk to just like whoever about it. And often like the callers who are not anarchists are saying things that I'm like, yeah, actually, I feel that. Like that's also what I was thinking about today. Which I think is pretty particular to this moment. Like I do lots of radio at the station, and often I feel like I'm sort of like, I'm explaining this thing that's already really important to me to you because I think it should also be really important to you, but probably you haven't even noticed it in the news cycle yet, maybe, in terms of like the listener, like the radio listener. Whereas this, it's like, we're actually having a conversation back and forth about the situation that I actually like I don't have any like more analysis of it really than like most of the callers who are calling in do already. Like they're all thinking about it all day also, which is like, I'm thinking about it all day. But yeah, it doesn't feel like really, I don't feel that much disconnect between myself and a lot of the people. Of course, some of them I do. Like some of them I'm like, oh wow, like that opinion is not an opinion that I share at all. But in terms of like anarchist versus non-anarchist, I don't really feel that same divide in this moment or on this topic really, personally.
Yeah, and I also think that this being a moment where everyone is kind of working through this globally and thinking on it more themselves. Like, everyone is in this present moment. Everyone is being affected in some fashion, even though, in Kingston, we are currently, apparently have no cases. Like, it's still something where everyone is talking about it and thinking about it and finding time in ways that it's like impacting their lives and finding new ways of trying different things and trying to live in different ways. And I think people are really excited to share those experiments and share those thoughts with others. So I think it's been really cool to, have folks who are just like, local mothers or whatever calling in to talk about the way that they're keeping their child entertained without, spending money or going to the park or something like that. Like,
running on that idea that we kind of wanted to do something that was not online. We saw like a lot of projects moving online and a lot of spaces closing. And right around the time that the pandemic really hit here, we were just at the tail end of like a reading group, and we tried to continue the reading group, and it was pretty hard to continue meeting. I think we had one more reading to do, and it was going to be about like responses to the pandemic, but it was so hard to even get people in the same room because everyone was so freaked out and like trying to navigate the ethics of like physical distancing. People really hadn't like figured it out at that point, including ourselves. And so, like Facebook, for example, is like such an alienating space where people can't see each other. And even just like being able to hear each other's voices when facilitating conversations, I think does a lot for creating like cross-pollination of ideas and empathy between people. And also it breaks us out of like our radical bubble a little bit in the sense of like CFRC, people pick it up when they're driving through town. A lot of different people listen to the radio station. There's a lot of different kinds of music, and it's not just like a radical space. So like we already are engaged in this project of the radio station because we want to interact with people who aren't already anarchists, and sort of getting ahead of the conversation around the pandemic and actually being able to like frame the conversation a little bit in terms of like every show we ask a question that we ask people to respond to. And it's very much a back and forth show, but we definitely frame the debate. And one of the reasons to do that is so that we can ask questions that like open up doors in people's minds about what is possible. Because I think anarchists do a lot of like intervening into existing discourse, but when we actually are like initiating discourse, I think there's actually a lot more power to shift what is like acceptable to talk about and create like new normals. So yeah, I think that was part of it too, is that we wanted to sort of like be a node of conversation in this community and ask questions that are like more interesting than what you're going to hear in the local newspaper, and invite a lot of engagement with those questions, which I think can kind of, create like an Overton window effect where people will like shift their ideas a little bit and they think outside the box a little more.
So when we're talking about that there are no pre-existing anarchist responses to the pandemic, I remember I always because I'm, a bit of like a history nerd, like whenever something comes up, I'm always like, is there a historical echo for that? Like, can I go back and see if there was if there have been people who've written about this, from an anarchist perspective? And I had an extremely difficult time finding anything. It feels like even in popular culture, people go back and they compare the current pandemic so much to the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, 1919. And, there's an immense, vibrant anarchist world at that time. But so many journals had stopped producing during that period because of World War I that I wasn't really able to find any anarchist writing about that pandemic either. So it really did feel kind of like being, kind of like there wasn't really a ready-made or even the barest bones architecture for what an anarchist position should look like in this moment. And I think one of the things that's really sort of stuck with me through this has been how dramatically opinions, even my own opinions, but everyone's opinions have sort of shifted from late February all the way through. It feels like every 2 weeks that goes by, I don't know if it's sort of slowed down now, but it definitely felt like every 2 weeks that went by for a little while, there'd be so much new information to try to process and form an opinion around. in order to like figure out like what you felt like you should be doing. That I don't know. I found myself almost sometimes like withdrawing a bit, because I was like, I really want to like just take the information that I have and try to figure it out so that I can figure out like how I want to act in this moment. And yeah, I guess that's a bit something that I'm a bit curious about, and I'd be interested to know from your perspectives, like how doing the project has changed your personal responses to the pandemic, especially in the sense when, you know, again, a lot of anarchist projects are like you were saying, sort of like trying to shift the conversation or trying to set the terms of the conversation. And I'm interested also to know if doing the project has caused like people, like, because you're talking to such a wide spectrum of people, if you felt like parts of their analysis or the things that they were thinking about the world ended up kind of like feeding back into how y'all thought about it.
I guess like the thing I would say about it, and it doesn't make me look good, but like there's a good chance that were I not doing this project or some kind of project that was like talking to people, I would like assume that my perspective is more distinct from non-anarchist perspectives than it is. Like I'd be like, oh, like everyone probably thinks it's great that like there's laws against going to parks right now, and like I think it's bad and I feel so lonely. But in fact, like most people who we've talked to are like, wow, yeah, like it's pretty ridiculous that you can't go to provincial parks. Like that's a great place to physically distance, you know? So I think in a way it's kind of humbling. Like I think about analyses that I've had. Not like I am usually like distant from people who are not anarchists. Like I think because we live in a smaller city, like we actually spend a lot of time all the time talking to people who are not anarchists. But like doing this project and talking about literally like most of the things I'm talking about or thinking about with anarchists, I'm also talking and thinking about like with whoever, like, or trying to on the show. And I think like it is good for me on a personal level to like see the ways that like in this moment, like critical things I feel or uncertainties I am feeling or things like that are in fact like not unique to like self-identified anarchists. Like they might be like anarchistic perspectives, but they're not ours alone. Which, you know, maybe is like very self-evident to most people. Like maybe that's just ridiculous, but I think I notice it more with this project just because like each, like 3 times a week, we're trying to think about how to frame a question and like what people are going to say about it, and like posting it on like local Kingston message boards and stuff, and like trying to get people to weigh in. And it's like, often it's like, oh yeah, you think what I think. That's cool, you know, like, which is like, yeah, maybe my perspective is boring, or maybe I would have found that more if I'd looked for it in other moments as well. I don't know.
To echo that, I've also been kind of like affirmed that the things that I think aren't so unique. Like I've had a lot of conversations and I've heard conversations with people on our radio show. And people have said things that I generally agree with. And I think I had a frustration in the first few weeks of, you know, the crisis really hitting Canada in March, that how people talked about things on the internet, which is like how I was kind of like seeing what people were talking about, is just so different than how people are willing to talk, how people are able to talk about things when they're like, when it's a voice conversation. And just, I don't know, I was really frustrated by how much shaming and just like very, like so many rude comments that would pop up on Facebook or Reddit or whatever when people disagreed with each other on how best to live their lives in the moment. And I think, yeah, doing the radio show has allowed me to see that like people are mostly, I mean, at least our callers, we like people are very reasonable and able to like articulate things in ways that are not like how people do on the internet, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also like, I feel like there have been several types of things that I have learned about that I didn't know that much about, along with maybe everyone else in the country who's watching the news, especially when it comes to like long-term care homes and the conditions. Like I was not super informed on that beyond having a grandparent there years ago and kind of having my own experience of going there to visit him. But I hadn't really like dug into like, how do these places work and what's the history of them and all that kind of stuff. And so in some ways, like we do sometimes just follow the news cycle with the show, but we kind of like ask a question with like a more critical spin to it and try to invite people who have direct experience to kind of like talk about that. So with long-term care, we had like a nurse who used to be a PSW come on the show and talk about, you know, some of the systemic issues with how long-term care works in Ontario and why these outbreaks are like hitting so bad and spreading from facility to facility. We did a show where we focused a lot on like the migrant workers in agricultural facilities in Canada, which have been really hard hit in Ontario and Alberta and Quebec, I believe. And so we had someone from Justicia for Migrant Workers come on and talk about that. And we had somebody who works for Ontario Health and Safety talk about like work refusals and how that's really difficult for migrant workers to do. So like I definitely have learned a lot about how kind of the details of like how these different settings like operate by like reaching out to people who are directly affected by these different forms that the crisis is taking, and you know, just asking some specific questions about like how this plays out and what's possible in terms of like collective responses to it. So I've definitely learned a lot through like having those exchanges.
I guess I'll also jump in and say that there have been a lot of things that I also felt like I didn't really know about, but wanted to speak about on the radio or like hear what other people thought about it. And it was like a good motivation to learn, like not enough, like it was good to kind of like help myself question like, oh yeah, I don't need to just take the word of an expert on like things like harm reduction practices or like mental health advice for like how to get through it, because like in fact people just talking about those things and like what they're doing and sharing techniques and stuff is like interesting and valid. But then I also sort of realized I was feeling this responsibility to not give people advice that would like mess them up in some intense way, and like trying to think through like, yeah, like how should I talk about these things, or like what kinds of like considerations should I be weighing here has been like a good exercise for me in general, I think.
I've also learned a lot about the range of conspiracy theories out there
Yeah.
because conspiracy theorists like disproportionately listen to the radio.
Killed the dinosaurs.
Yeah, and like I think it's important to like, most of the people who have called with their theories have not been bad people, and like they're not like advancing like explicitly racist conspiracy theories as far as we can tell. They're just like, you know, like on a different part of the internet than I'm used to seeing, and like, yeah, I don't know. There's a whole like radio listening demographic that I feel like is specific that we've also heard from, and it's certainly got me thinking about like how to sort of like empathetically engage and deconstruct some of those ideas, because I had my assumptions about like every person with a conspiracy theory is like far right, like a far right nationalist or something, and that's really not the case. Even though those ideas like are often very dangerous and need to be combated, I think that there's like, yeah, that's been an interesting part of the experience, I guess. Yeah.
To respond to one of the things that y'all mentioned earlier, I do think it's really interesting the way that the voice component really changes the way that the conversations happen. I don't know if it's that, you know, there's this opportunity to have a back and forth, but like when you're trying to text something, like, or when you write a text and you put it up, it's like you only get one shot, you know, like it just goes up and then people begin to respond to it. And it's like, if what you wrote immediately falls apart, you have like no opportunity to like clarify or to be like, oh, well, actually, like that's not quite what I meant, you know. And I feel like the inability to be able to and I feel like people kind of know that when they're posting or when they're writing, and the inability to be able to like really make it clear what you're saying, I think can be like a really large barrier to communication. I know that for my own part, as things were happening, I was extremely hesitant to really like talk to people outside of my immediate sphere about what my opinions and ideas were about this. Because like largely I saw it as like I would probably be communicating in text form, and I was like, I don't want to see these things like just like I had this feeling as though like if what I said was just immediately like shot to pieces, then it's like I wouldn't get another chance to continue to like think and form through it. Like it would kind of be like, you know, like sometimes all it takes is like one pithy like cutting remark to like make you just completely abandon the line of thought that you're sort of building along. And when you are engaging with someone in a kind of voice back and forth, I think you have maybe like more of an opportunity to develop to develop your thinking with people. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that partly for me, the reason that's happening is because the show is so frequent. So like I also do a podcast that goes out to like mostly, I guess, like anarchy land kind of. And I feel like I do get kind of perfectionist about that. Like I'm like, I shouldn't say something unless I really for sure mean it. Whereas on the radio show, because it's live and because it's 3 times a week, there isn't always time to like perfect your perspective before you go live with it. So it is more of a conversation for me. I don't know if it feels that way for the listeners or not, because probably calling into the show does take a little bit more, like you got to psych up for that to some extent.
Well, and it's more engaging for people to call in when there's some banter and some humanity to it, right? Like,
maybe, yeah. And also just like, I think we aren't presenting like something on the level of like a text that we've written that's like completely been edited and is like totally certain. We're more presenting questions. And I feel like about many things on this topic, like all I really have is questions. So it's like, it's a lot easier. Like I really feel you, moderator. Like I also have like 5 Word documents on my desktop of like stuff that I started writing to send to friends about this that like have not gone out because I don't feel like confident enough about what I would say. Like I feel like it could be misinterpreted and then people will be like, oh, you like agree with the state or you're not taking it seriously or like whatever. But on the show, it's more possible to just be like, what about this? What do people think about this? And kind of just feel it out as we go, for me at least.
I feel like I've also discovered that, I don't know, I sometimes expected that I would share my perspective and I had all these fears that people would find it like totally horrifying. Like, oh, like you want to go outside? You're a murderer. And like, that's just like not like, it is hearing a whole range of different people, from people who are like, yeah, I'm staying in my house and not going outside and I haven't seen another human in months, to like people who are like, I don't know, my life looks pretty much the same. Like it has just helped me feel like, oh yeah, I don't think I'm on some like extreme end of the spectrum or something on like questions around like what to do and how to deal. And yeah, that has just been like interesting and good, I think, to realize.
Yeah, we've actually had a lot of feedback from people who don't necessarily call, but they listen to the show. And I would say the most common thing that people have said is that they just feel less anxious from listening to the show, which I don't know why exactly that is, because we're raising a lot of like, you know, really brutal situations where people are like, you know, really suffering from the pandemic and everything. But I think it's just that feeling that they're not going through this completely alone, and that like that there's like, I don't know, it's not like sensationalist news. It's like people who are trying to have a conversation and like kind of keep it together and stay connected through like a very difficult time.
yeah. Well, and I've got a couple of friends who, well, they're like anarchist leaning in some sense, would not call themselves anarchists by any sense, and probably wouldn't label their politics, who do listen to the show. And I think their primary feedback saying that it's been like very soothing and calming and stuff like that comes from the sense that these are questions and conversations that they themselves would be having with people right now, or wish they were having with people right now. Maybe they're too afraid to call into the show because of whatever social anxiety or whatever. But being able to hear other people kind of puzzle through it and have those discussions, I think really does help people, instead of it just being like a panel of experts or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, in the sense of like when the show started, and I sort of started tuning in, and I would hear like, you know, friends' voices calling into the show, and that definitely felt anxiety reducing in that sense, especially because, you know, I'm like, okay, like how often do I regularly see people? Like maybe not even that many times a month, but like when suddenly everything feels as though it's just disappeared, it's just like really nice to just like see that like things are still going on, that like people are still finding ways to work with each other and like to do things together and to like share projects. Yeah. And I also totally feel that of being like, it's also, I think, anxiety reducing to see people grappling with those kind of questions and to kind of like to hear the doubt that people have in their voices when they're talking about what they think are the ways forward. Because it's like, it's very, well, I'm not going to say that it's easy, but like it can be very easy to speak very authoritatively. And it's, but I feel like when you do, it like I feel anxiety ridden because I'm like, oh God, like I'm saying this thing and people are going to really think like I really do know what I'm talking about. And like, and it is very anxiety reducing to be able to be like, look, I'm just trying to figure this thing out with you alongside everyone else in society, the way that you were saying.
Yeah, and a really important part of the show to me is that we invite people who disagree with us to call and to try to like talk about that. And it doesn't happen that often. Oftentimes, like, I mean, we don't perfectly agree with everyone who calls, but like usually it's a fairly friendly conversation. But like we did get some comments. We did one show about like, you know, has the time come to like free all prisoners? And we're like trying to normalize that idea because, you know, normal or whatever, I don't know, liberal people or something are talking about this as a possibility, which 2 months ago was pretty unthinkable. And we got some responses that were like, this is leftist lunacy and blah, blah, blah. But we like read those responses and like we had someone who was sort of a historian of epidemics in Canada and was talking about like releases during like other outbreaks in Canadian history. And we just kind of like responded to it as sort of comfortably as we could. And yeah, I think like that dynamic is actually like a really good thing as opposed to this kind of like super ideological, super like, if you don't agree with us, we don't want to hear from you, or we're just going to like, you know, make fun of you or something like that. There's a place for that, but that's not really what this particular project is about.
I think it's also such an unprecedented thing for all of us. And just to speak for myself, I often just don't know what people should be doing. You know, I don't know. I like have opinions that change frequently, and I can't speak to like, I can't comfortably say this is how people should be living right now because I just have no idea.
I think also like, so that person, the person who like messaged in and was like, oh, we should not free prisoners, like is actually like an online personality who has like trolled us for years with various things and like tore down every poster for May Day last year. Like literally went around the city and tore down every single poster and then bragged about it on the internet. And then came to May Day with a bag of torn up posters to be like, look, this is all the litter you put all over the neighborhood. And it's that guy. It's that guy who's like, you know, on the show, and we're putting him on the show, which usually we would not. But his perspective is like, on this question, like online, that guy right now, other than the don't free prisoners question, like his perspective on most questions we've asked has been like, oh yeah, like people should physically distance because the virus is a real threat, but also the state shouldn't be cracking down on people in these ways. And I'm like, wow, like I also think that, and I hate you so much. And like this thing cuts across so many lines. It's like kind of like a different kind of conversation. Like not like I want to be nice to that person, like that person probably is like really not worth my time.
We had to literally get a ladder to start postering so that he couldn't cut them down last year.
But then he carried something with him and climbed up it.
But like, yeah, but I don't know. I just feel like this question is like, it really like, you really can't tell who's going to think what. Like there are people who I thought of as allies before
who are saying things right now in public space on the internet that I really disagree with, that I feel really uncomfortable with. And there's people like that guy who are like basically saying the same thing as me. And I feel like really kind of unsettled by this shift that's going on. And it's just kind of nice to be able to like have those conversations like on the radio with people in a way that feels calmer than it would if it was on like, say, Facebook, where it feels like very intense and frantic and like anxiety inducing. Not like I would converse with that guy probably anywhere other than on the radio, but yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of like it's a different time, and it calls for different things, and like everyone's perspective is shifting, including this weird far right troll, and my perspective is shifting all the time. It's like, I don't know. I think it's kind of like an interesting space to have those kinds of chats.
When I got the music, I got a place to go.
I was talking to a friend in Tucson the other day, and we were talking about the way that, you know, time during the pandemic just feels like it's melting away into one vast kind of like, you know, undifferentiated mass. And it's kind of great to have things like the show that kind of like reestablish time for some of us who like are in that kind of like serbed out, like, you know, every day is the same day kind of state.
You had us muted, but we all laughed really loudly
We're still
when you
laughing,
said served
sorry.
out. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I have really appreciated, like, as a participant in the project, having, like, basically the project, I'm laid off right now, so the project really structures my week, and that has been helpful through a time where, yeah, time passes at a very strange rate.
I think that like within the group of us, there's a really wide range of people who like thrive in and need structure, and those who prefer to not have as much of it. And for me, I think when everything started to get a bit wonky and get canceled, I was like inwardly kind of thrilled with this one idea that like everyone's routines would kind of, or a lot of the routines that people don't like and that kind of weigh them down would like disappear, including my own. But like, I think that having one thing, like literally one thing in the week that is regular and has to get done has been like a positive experience, and is sometimes maybe the one thing that prevents my sense of time from like bleeding together into that one like served out mass.
I think it's interesting you're saying that like the pandemic kind of collapses time for you, because I've been sort of feeling the same thing about space to some extent. Like I feel just as present with people in like far off places as I do with some people who live in Kingston who I normally would have seen like all the time. And in some ways that's good and interesting, actually. Like there's things about it that I'm enjoying. Like I'm back in touch with friends far away who previously I didn't have a lot of time to be in touch with. And actually there's people, maybe you're listening, who are at the book fair who like haven't been able to come to the Montreal Book Fair for years because of borders. And that's kind of neat. But also in some ways it's like I actually really miss like local engagement and like embodied engagement, where like there are some people who are like my in-town crew who I see, and there are other people who are like a special treat who are far away. And that's like, it can feel kind of like displaced in a way. Like it's like it's hard to remember sometimes, like, oh, like some of these people like live literally down the street from me. Like earlier I heard a panel moderated by someone who lives like 2 blocks from me. And I haven't really seen that person other than in passing in like months. And it's like that voice is just as present to me as like your voice right now. And I wouldn't normally see you more than every few months. And for me, the show, while there is a component that is doing that, like is partly like that, like there are people calling in from all over the place. It's also kind of like undoing that to some extent, because like sometimes I'll hear from people who I haven't seen in a long time who tuned in, or sometimes people will call in who I know to some extent and they live in Kingston, but I haven't seen them or really even thought about them in many months. And it's kind of like this reminder of like place as well as time that I'm really enjoying in this moment.
Yeah, and maybe like we have framed the topics of the shows as being like really hard-hitting political questions every time, but we actually leave a lot of space for like shout outs and like random song requests for people's birthdays. in some ways, May Day was both like a political thing and also like a I don't know, collective social ritual that we tried to have. Which we were pretty bummed out to not do May Day this year. I'll speak for myself, but just having something like that was definitely nice. Like we usually would have a bunch of speeches in the park, and we just got people to record them and shared them on the radio and encourage people to like sort of gather with their germ units and listen. But it's like we do some like lighter stuff. And like several of us have had like our parents call in, like my mom called on Mother's Day and we like talked about that. Like it's also been just like a space to kind of like socialize as well as to have like, you know, the hard hitting political debate about what's going on and what are we going to do about it.
Yeah, someone in the chat asked a bit about how folks got involved in doing radio to begin with. And I was just curious, do y'all know how, I know you have access to the community radio station, but one thing that I think with the book fair this year that's sort of like, I didn't really think about before we started doing this all in such a whirlwind, was that like, while sure it was kind of difficult to get all of this set up, it was actually like way easier than one might think. Like it was all so possible, and very few of us had that much actual technological knowledge. So yeah, I don't know, maybe you be able to just talk for a minute about how you got involved with radio.
So I guess like two of us have been doing the prison radio show for a number of years. Three of us do like an anarchist radio show that's also a podcast. That this is the 2-year anniversary, this book fair, actually, of that show right now.
Called From Embers. It's called.
And then the other 3 people joined this project for this project.
Yeah, well, I've done like queer radio shows and like talk shows before for that.
And in terms of how we first got involved in radio, I guess for me in Kingston at least, apart from like random like CKUT late night spots when I lived in Montreal, I think prison was the way in, at least for 2 of us. Like the fact that radio is a format that prisoners can access, and there aren't that many direct paths of communication that aren't mediated through the mailroom other than radio. Like it's actually one of the least censored ways you can speak to incarcerated people in Kingston. And people had been doing the prison radio show before us for years. And I think we were doing other prison related projects and kind of felt, at least I kind of felt, that the prison show was building like better connections than I was building through my other prison media projects. So I like wanted to get involved in the prison show. And since then, like all but one of those people has left the prison show. So now it's 2 of us and one other person who do it mostly for the most part. Which I never really intended. Like I didn't really want to take it on to that extent, but I'm kind of glad I did, because I think that show is a really important project, because there's just not a lot of ways to have that specific kind of engagement, like with prisoners in particular. And then I think also doing that show brought us to the radio station, which I kind of realized is like this cool kind of alternative but not anarchist space that exists in town. And some of us floated the idea of like having an anarchist radio show as a way of kind of asserting anarchism in that space and like bringing radical politics into that space in a way that would be more explicit, because there's a lot of engagement between like people with weird politics and people who make weird art in the station. And we wanted to kind of like bring our politics into that mix. But I would say that Radio Pandemic has done that more than From Embers ever actually successfully did, from my perspective. Like right now, the 6 of us are like, we're doing like the pandemic show for the radio station, and other people who are involved in the station actually really listen to the show. And every time I see them, they're like, oh, I really love the pandemic show. And anarchists are like framing that conversation for the whole world that surrounds the radio station, and many of the listeners too, to an extent that like having an anarchist radio show that airs at 8 p.m. that you tell your friends to listen to kind of never could. So yeah, I feel like I'm just now kind of achieving that goal of like bringing anarchist politics into the normal life of the radio station with this show. I don't know if other folks with like a previous radio involvement want to answer that question differently.
My like previous radio involvement was pretty scattershot, but was way more in the realm of like connections through random art stuff or music world stuff, like and just like doing occasional shows. But for me it was like wanting to maintain relationships with people who aren't anarchists, because I just think that is a thing that I think is important to do and feels good and makes me feel like a normal human person. And the radio station is like the kind of people who like it seem to be like the kind of people who like, I don't know, find lots of other things about like the normal world or whatever, like not super enjoyable. So it's like easier to relate, and like we'll end up at the same shows, or like I genuinely like a lot of the music shows that people put on, because you really don't hear that kind of stuff on like normal radio or whatever. So it just seemed kind of like natural, and I'm increasingly like the longer I've been doing it, the more like convinced I am that it was a good idea and that I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, I used to do a show in 2006 that was an anarchist show that's really embarrassing to listen to now, and I will not tell you how to find the archives for that. And I've been sort of on and off involved with the radio station since then. And I think I went through a period where I felt like I didn't want to participate in institutions that weren't explicitly anarchist for a while. But then when we lost like a local cafe called the Sleepless Goat, that was like this really important space of like cross-pollination, and like did a lot of that sort of like socializing that like is required for like finding new people and like building new relationships, and also learning from other people, because sometimes anarchists feel like they have all the answers, and that's not the case. Sort of reflecting on that place going bankrupt and closing, and what a loss like it felt like in Kingston was a big part for me in like reconsidering the radio station and its part in Kingston and the space that it provides, especially because it's part of Queen's University, and Queen's is a very like white and rich school. It's a very elite school, and there's not a lot of space for even like typical campus radicalism. Like even the kind of like PERG is constantly embattled. And so, yeah, I think the station like plays a pretty important role both on campus and in the community. And because of those relationships through the prison radio station, which I think the prison radio show, which the radio station is like very supportive of, and From Embers, the anarchist show, we had like the existing relationships and goodwill, where it was like super easy to pitch the show and have it on the air within, like I said, 3 days from when we came up with the idea to when we were doing it, which was great, like to have that level of support.
Yeah, totally. I have another thing I've always loved was those like early 90s autonomedia books. I don't know if folks know what I'm talking about necessarily, or I'm sure like a lot of people actually do know what I'm talking about, but anyway, they seem crazy old to me. And Autonomedia had all these like great like radio, like pirate radio, and you know, like guerrilla gardening and like other like 90s anarchist things that I always thought were like really cool. And yeah, I don't know, it's really great to I feel, you know, anarchists have really embraced podcasts, but it's been really awesome to see like just that radio can continue to be like a really interesting vector of engagement with the world that we're in. There's another question asked in the chat. Do you ever talk about anarchism directly on the show? And if so, how do you describe it to people who have no idea what it is? And we're kind of coming up to the end of the hour, so maybe we could use that as a bit of a sign-off question.
I don't know if I've personally talked about anarchism. I think how, in my experience, it's communicated is we share news, like we share initiatives and news that we think is cool. So like projects that people are doing in Canada or in the US or elsewhere that we think are cool, and those are usually anarchist projects. And I think that's a way that's communicated. I don't think I've ever said like this is what anarchism is, but I think just it gets communicated in our ideas, like in our opinions on world events, I guess, on the things that we comment on. But I'm not sure if like we formulate our ideas as like this is our political belief or anything like that.
I mean, interestingly, there have also been like other radicals who are not necessarily anarchists, and sometimes other anarchists who have like called into the show and like shared a perspective, and then through the conversation of like us talking about the question of the state or whatever. Like some of those like debates sort of happen. I can't think of like I don't think anyway, and I'm pretty sure no one else has been like, today's show is about anarchism. Let us explain it to you.
We could do that though.
Yeah, no, for sure. But we've totally been like, yeah, today we're talking about the police, and the whole show is about like why we don't like them, or like we've been like, some of us do this other anarchist radio show, or like, oh, this anarchist project in whatever is like cool, you guys should check it out. Like it's I don't think any of us are, well, whatever. I'm not trying to like pretend I'm not an anarchist or like not share those ideas. It's just I already have an entire other radio show that is about being like, here is anarchism, let me tell you about it. So yeah, it feels like chiller to just like have it come up through stories and conversation.
Yeah, I've done it more on prison radio. Like several times there's been like this kind of engagement where someone's like, well, why do you care about this thing? And I'm like, well, I care about this thing because I'm an anarchist and I think there shouldn't be a state and therefore shouldn't be prisons. On Radio Pandemic, it hasn't come up that explicitly that I can remember yet, but it absolutely could. And I think none of us are hiding our political positions on Radio Pandemic. Like there's no secrets, as far as I know, at least.
Well, and I think there's been a couple of times where callers who maybe we've known or callers who've related to us have been like, yeah, like, you know, as anarchists, like you and I both think this thing. And I'll be like, well, I mean, you and I both think this thing and we are in fact anarchists, like, you know, but again, it's not really saying that's the totalizing opinion of anarchists, but you know what I'm getting at. But I think that, yeah, I don't think we've on out to do like an Anarchy 101 through this.
I would say that the Mayday show was the closest thing to like a very explicitly anarchist show, because we did the whole like a brief history of Mayday, and like the statements weren't all from anarchists, but it was like, I don't know, it's a more like ideological holiday than maybe people want to think or something. But also we have like, because From Embers airs on Wednesday night, and Wednesday is the day that we do like a 2-hour show, in part because of like time saving and in part because it kind of works. Oftentimes we'll do a show for From Embers that is like on a similar topic to the thing that we're talking about on the Wednesday. And then we'll like share some clips from Embers on the Radio Pandemic show and be like, and that's usually like a much more explicitly anarchist like interview. And then we're like, hey, if you want to like listen to this whole thing, or you're interested more in then listen in at 8:00. So it's kind of like points towards that more like very explicitly ideological space. But I think, you know, I don't really want to go too hard on the like anarchism piece for Radio Pandemic, because we really want to invite people to call and we want them to feel like that show's also for them to participate in. So it's not about like hiding politics so much as it's about like trying not to sort of close the bounds of what can be talked about on the show too much.
Yeah, I wanted to say something that's very actually similar to what you just said, which is that I suspect that the fact that it's not talked about explicitly has a very large part in why people are actually engaged with it across a lot of different social scenes in town. And I, like, for me personally, there are even people in town that I have like touched on kind of political conversations with in person, and I feel like if the word anarchism comes up, people just kind of withdraw, or like almost are like prepared to feel. Sometimes that can be a conversation that makes people like feel bad, or like they're preparing for like a level of being condescended at. What's the word? Condescension? I don't know. And like I can relate to that like extremely, and I think that it's interesting that those people are listening to the show though, and they have things to say about it and they have opinions about it. But it's almost like just because that label is not coming up, people feel more comfortable having conversations that I've seen them like be uncomfortable with in person.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also like when I'm on the show talking to people and people call in, I find the like, I love it when our anarchist friends call in. I like hearing from them. I also sometimes feel kind of bored because I'm like, yeah, I know. We already think this thing or something. And like hearing from people just talk about their lives, or hearing my anarchist friends like just talk about their experience of their life or something is like the thing I find most like interesting and compelling.
I got the music, well, I got a place to go. When I got the music, well, I got a place to go. Well, I got a place, well, I got a place, well, I got a place to go. When I got the music, well, I got a place to go. When I got the music, I got a place to go. When I got the music, I got a place to go. When I got the music, I got a place to go. When I got the music, I got a place to go.
With protests continuing in cities all over the world, the Channel Zero network has some reminders on how to support those who have been arrested, and those who may be arrested in the coming days and weeks.
Arrests are one tool cops use to repress mass movements. Arrests keep protesters off the streets during demonstrations. They scare people with the threat of court cases and potential prison sentences. Alone, we feel defenseless against the police and the courts. By providing jail and court support, we can push back against this repression, from the moment our comrades are taken in to the end of their court case.
Before heading out into the streets, make sure you and everyone you're with has a contact number written on their body. You'll need to get in touch with someone if you're arrested, and you most likely won't have your personal belongings with you. This number can be the National Lawyers Guild, a group you're currently involved with, or just a friend who's not at the protest.
If you see someone getting arrested, call your legal support number with the arrestee's legal name and birthday. If you're in a large city, you may have to determine where they will be taken. Try to find the arresting officer's precinct or unit. This may determine where your comrade ends up. In smaller cities, everyone may go to the same place.
If you expect more arrests, try to stay and observe. If not, you should head to the precinct and wait for the arrestee.
Once at the precinct, use the legal name and birthday of the arrestee to ask the cops for the arrest number, charges, and where the arrestee will be taken or held. Keep anyone supporting you in the loop.
Be prepared to wait many hours. Keep in touch with others and take turns waiting outside the precinct. In some cases, it may take the whole night, especially if there's been a mass arrest.
From here, each city and state has different processes and different jargon. Connect with local organizers and read about local laws to learn what the process will be in your area. Here are some things you might encounter.
Sometimes arrestees are released quickly with a notice that they'll need to show up in court at a later date. If this happens, take the contact info of the arrestee. You'll want to be ready to offer them court support in the future.
Sometimes, arrestees are charged before release. This is a longer process, usually called arraignment, which is a procedural court hearing to file charges and set bail. The court will assign a public defender for arraignments. Try to have a couple of friends attend the arraignment for support. Due to COVID-19, you may only be able to observe via video.
Sometimes arrestees will have to post bail to be released. If bail is set, let the court officer know you're arranging payment and will be coordinating with the arrestee's lawyer. If you need support making bail, connect with local organizers. There may be a bail fund for protesters in your area.
No matter what happens, always relay what's happening to other people offering support.
Regardless of the legal situation the arrestee ends up in, you'll need to bring some things with you. People who are getting out may be exhausted or have trouble getting home. So bring snacks, water, aspirin, bus fare, transit cards, and cigarettes. If you have a friend being held, you can bring their favorite snacks. If you know the arrestee requires specific medication, make sure to bring that too.
You'll also need water and snacks to sustain yourself. Bring external batteries for charging phones as you may be waiting many hours.
If you can't stay and help with jail support, dropping off materials to those waiting can be a big help.
Unfortunately, there is a high risk of exposure to COVID-19 while in an enclosed jail cell. Arrestees should consider self-quarantining and getting tested.
For every street action and every viral video of arrests, there are dozens of people outside the spotlight supporting the movement. It's not over till everyone's safely gotten out of prison and everyone's beaten their charges.
Check out Rebel Steps jail support episode at rebelsteps.com/jail support for more tips and resources.
And follow Unicorn Riot and Channel Zero Network member It's Going Down for more updates.
The Channel Zero Network sends y'all solidarity.
Stay safe out there and never stop fighting for a better world.